Sustainability revolution is the single largest business and investing opportunity in the entire history of the world.
ESG, real or marketing?
It's a complete fraud.
And we had about 448 different ESG-related company engagements with boards and executive management last year. For us, it's much more of a risk mitigation tool.
It's a fraud because it's not better for shareholders. It's not better for stockholders. Look, JP Morgan and Goldman Sachs both announced they're not going to do lending in the Arctic for drilling. I mean, how is that better for the shareholders of Goldman Sachs and JP Morgan?
The ESG industry has tripled in size over the past 8 years, growing from $19 trillion in assets in 2014 to $55 trillion today. By 2025, ESG investments are projected to grow to more than half of all global assets under management. Who are the players in this system? ESG activists include the world's largest asset managers, who together control more than $20 trillion in investments. It includes America's largest public pension funds. It includes the world's largest banks. It includes global clubs of CEOs and political leaders, like the World Economic Forum. And it includes a host of other activist finance clubs, such as Climate Action 100+, the Glasgow Financial Alliance for Net Zero, and the Net Zero Asset Management Initiative. Companies who join these clubs sign pledges to use their corporate power to reduce fossil fuel production in favor of things like wind and solar energy and electric cars.
It means a large group of asset managers have taken these factors into account when deciding how to invest their money, but not just how to invest their money, but when they invest their money in companies, what principles they have to use as a shareholder to advocate for policies in corporate America's boardrooms.
From now on, companies will focus on achieving ESG goals. How do we know how well they're doing in this? Well, a number of rating agencies have stepped up to give ESG ratings. And not only to companies, but also to countries and even to US states. ESG ratings let investors know who is ESG compliant and who isn't. And for those who get a bad ESG rating, the agencies have ESG consultants who, for a fee, will help get those ESG scores up where they should be. So this is the plan. Get companies on board, get them in line with the agenda, and together we solve the problems of climate change, inequality, racism, and gun violence. How do we know ESG is the way to go? Simple, because we're all going there. And yet, despite all the best intentions of the ESG industry, there are dissonant voices who say they're concerned.
In a free market system, corporations, companies, business entities, their sole purpose is supposed to be to make money for their shareholders. It forces companies to go out and figure out how they can serve their fellow human being, whether that be growing food, cooking food, producing goods and services that you want to buy. Well, fascism takes that idea and it allows you to keep the private ownership component in a way, but it also hijacks the purpose of the company away from making profit, away from serving the consumer, and toward government-approved goals. And that's what we're seeing with the ESG. ESG are these nebulous concepts of environmental benefits and social benefits and governance, etc. These are goals that are set by governments and policymakers primarily.
The people who control the flow of capital ultimately direct the flow of capital into every industry and shape the behavior of every industry. Because you know what, BlackRock and State Street and Vanguard, these are just three firms. It's actually a much bigger list than that, but just those top three control about $21 trillion. That's about the size of the US GDP. So I think they're among the largest shareholders of nearly every company in the S&P 500. 20 to 30% of the voting power of many of the large companies in this country are wielded by the hands of those three firms. So if you have the gold, you make the rules. The people who control the flow of capital control the flow of values in the marketplace of ideas in corporate America.
The way that
these fund managers use ESG to push progressive politics is multifaceted. The first and probably the most public is that they get to vote the shares that they're managing. The more quiet, sort of less public way is that they have what they call engagement meetings with corporate leadership on these issues. And when they show up, they don't say, hey, we're just representing ourselves. They say we represent ownership of 7.5%, 10%, 20% of your publicly traded shares. BlackRock, State Street, and Vanguard put together would be the largest single shareholder and 90% of the S&P 500. So when your largest shareholder calls you and says, hey, I want a meeting and I've got some things I want you to be concerned about and focus on, you have to listen.
To encourage the behavior that he wants to see, BlackRock CEO Larry Fink sends an annual letter to CEOs that sets the agenda for the coming year and lets them know the issues they should focus on.
Well, if you read his annual letter to CEOs, Larry Fink actually thinks he needs to tell the world CEOs every year what BlackRock thinks, so they know what to do. He doesn't have to go around and go to every shareholder meeting. He just tells them what to do in a letter. And the letter the year before last said that we need to get to net zero carbon emissions by 2050, which will require a transformation of the entire economy. I don't remember voting for Larry Fink to transform the entire economy. I don't want him to transform the entire economy. We have the greatest economy in the history of the world.
In addition to the world's largest asset managers, America's largest state pension funds, based in states like California and New York, have used the public pension money that they control to drive the ESG agenda. The ESG movement has created its own vested interests, giving rise to an entire industry on Wall Street for tracking, measuring, rating, and profiting from ESG. This includes rating agencies, consultants, accountants, proxy agents, and investment managers. For investment managers, the ESG movement has been especially lucrative. It allows them to charge higher fees because ESG funds are actively managed.
Large Wall Street banks are not charitable institutions. They expect something in return for that. And then you look at which firms are rewarded with government packages, like who gets the COVID-19 stimulus packages. A lot of that flowed through BlackRock.
What we're seeing is a new revolving door in Washington. We're seeing liberal activists, whether they're in the administration or on Capitol Hill, instead of leaving those positions and going to K Street to become lobbyists in Washington, what we're seeing now is they're going to Wall Street and they're using the enormous influence that these Wall Street firms have to really drive policy at the state and local level in a way they haven't done before.
Brian Dees, who's head of national economic policy for the Biden administration, he's straight out of BlackRock. And you have Tom Donilon, who's now been put in charge of a significant portion of our foreign policy vis-a-vis China. And again, he comes right out of BlackRock. And as you go down the line, I mean, the Biden administration has been heavily staffed by BlackRock alums. And in some cases, it's even scary, some of the issues that they handled when they were at BlackRock. Tom Donilon, for example, recommended to clients while he was there that they triple their exposure to China. And now he's in charge of a portion of the Biden administration's foreign policy vis-a-vis China.
The Biden administration has been a strong advocate of the ESG agenda. Since Joe Biden assumed office, his administration has systematically altered the mission of virtually every federal agency toward the pursuit of environmental and racial goals. The U.S. Federal Reserve, whose official mission is to fight inflation and keep unemployment low, has declared climate change and racial justice to be among its top priorities. The Fed's San Francisco office issued a statement that racial equity is central to the Fed's mission. The U.S. Treasury Department, whose official mission is to maintain a strong economy, has established a new Racial Equity Committee, and its newly appointed vice chair vowed to make racial equity central to the Treasury Department's mission. The U.S. Department of Justice has also taken on a political role. announcing in May that it would focus on climate justice. The Environmental Protection Agency attempted to dictate a national energy policy by forcing utilities to switch from fossil fuels to wind and solar, a move that was struck down by the Supreme Court as unconstitutional. The Department of Labor instituted a new rule under the Biden administration, which allows private pension funds to invest on ideological grounds rather than purely for economic returns. The Office of the Comptroller of the Currency, a bank regulator, instituted a rule under the Biden administration that gives banks the right to discriminate against entire industries for ideological reasons. And the Securities and Exchange Commission, an agency set up to protect small investors from securities fraud, announced new climate accounting standards for all listed companies.
The new SEC rule for quote-unquote climate disclosures is probably one of the most terrifying pieces of regulation to come out of the SEC in its entirety of its existence. There's sort of three portions to it. It's called Scope 1, 2, 3. The idea is that at each scope you're talking about how much emissions, carbon emissions are coming out of certain activities. Scope 1, pretty straightforward. It's the company's own emissions when they make a product. Scope 2 asks them to account for the carbon emissions of their vendors that go into the making of the product. So for example, if you're a car manufacturer, you have to go and collect all the carbon emissions for all of your providers. Well, here's what's particularly horrifying about that. Those companies themselves may not be publicly traded, and yet through this rule, they're going to go force people to go force their vendors to adhere to this. And then Scope 3 is somehow even worse. Scope 3 is climate disclosures or carbon emissions disclosures around the consumer's use of the product. Scope 3 means there's going to be a huge incentive to start tracking the behaviors of consumers, putting literal trackers on the products.
Personal social credit scores are taking hold in China, where people's ability to travel, get jobs, or get into good schools is determined by their personal behavior. What they say or write, what websites they read, even how much time they spend playing video games. But could we ever have social credit scores for people here in the West? It seems fantastical to even contemplate that. And yet, the technology is nearly there.
We're developing, through technology, an ability for consumers to measure their own carbon footprint. What does that mean? That's where are they traveling? How are they traveling? What are they eating? What are they consuming on the platform? So individual carbon footprint tracker.